I was walking down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. My name is Dr. Tobique Christie.
And I'm Matthew Martin.
And we have a wonderful episode for you today with Dr. David Perley. And before we introduce our guests, I'd just like to remind our viewers of the action items that we're calling for here at NBWA. So the first is that we think that education systems should incorporate accurate information about how racist Canada's history actually is and how this country of ours has been built on the back of people through racial discrimination. This includes information about Canada's white-only immigration policy. It would include information about the genocide of Indigenous people. So we're looking for education in a critical race theory-based way. The second thing we think we need is a public inquiry into systemic racism here in New Brunswick. We don't think that it's going to be possible to tinker and that we have to get to the root causes of what the ailments in our society are today. And then, of course, the third thing that we're calling for is the criminalization of racial discrimination. And we think that the current approach that we take to discrimination through the human rights model is completely inadequate, and that we need to criminalize racial discrimination, and it should be a crime punishable under the Criminal Code of Canada. So those are our action items here at NBWA. But that being said, I would like to introduce our guest, Dr. Perley. And Dr. Perley, I'm wondering if you could take a minute to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. My name is David Perley. I am joining you from Tobique First Nation, and this is, of course, all of this. The Wolastoqi Valley, or St. John River Valley, is the traditional territory of my ancestors. It's unceded territory, unsurrendered territory. So we like to acknowledge that to share this historical fact with all New Brunswick citizens that prior to contact with European settlers, we had the Wabanaki people here, the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqi, and of course the Passamaquoddies. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share with you my experiences and the experiences of Wabanaki people with racism.
I think it would be helpful for our viewers to understand a little bit about systemic racism and systemic discrimination. So from my perspective, for instance, if you look at the population, the prison population in Canada, so out of all the federal prison population, Indigenous people are represented by over 900%. If you look at police shootings, Indigenous people make up 4.5% of the Canadian population, but 40% of people shot and killed by police. If you look at the foster care system, Indigenous people make up 4.5% of the Canadian population, but 52% of the kids in foster care. So if the system was designed fairly and it had no discriminatory effects on people, you'd think that the distribution would be fairly even. There would be 4.5% of the prison population, 4.5% of people shot and killed by police, 4.5% of the foster care system, but they're not. They're overrepresented by astronomical numbers.
Yes.
I find this conclusive. I find this slap down, knock 'em out dead evidence of systemic racism. It strikes me as obvious. But as a professor, I give many lectures around the province, and I've been teaching, trying to do things on anti-racism and anti-discrimination for the past long time. And other people don't find that evidence conclusive. They will say, well, that could be a reflection of some cultural things. It could be a reflection of the prevalence of substance use in those communities. It could be a reflection of living conditions on a reserve or something like that. So I hear all of these things. I disagree with them, but I hear them. And what I find is, when I reflect on these, is that people are reasoning according to stereotypes. And these stereotypes are lies we've been told generation after generation after generation, but people believe these things. And that's why when I look at evidence that I find conclusive, they look at evidence that just confirms their stereotype. So we're wondering, would you be able to take a couple of minutes and share your thoughts on systemic racism?
Sure. Well, basically, there's no doubt about it that it is systemic racism when you look at the outcomes in the education system, for example, as well as you just shared the statistics on within the justice system, and it also happens in the economic system and the political system and so on. It's the actions that and the practices of those people who are controlling those institutions. They're being influenced by, you mentioned stereotypes. That's absolutely true. You know, the actions that they take are influenced by the stereotypes that they have about First Nations people, about Wabanaki people here in New Brunswick. And they're also influenced by misconceptions they have. The lazy Indian, the drunken Indian, the Indian that wants to go on welfare rather than go out there and work and so on. So all of these misconceptions have influenced the practices of the civil servants, the politicians, and others who have some authority within the colonial institutions. And I hear that every day as well. You know, in my own classes at UNB, you know, from the non-Indigenous students who are in the class, they would share with me that they have those stereotypes. They have those misconceptions, and they learned them from their parents or from their family members or from others within their communities. So those stereotypes have survived. You know, the negative stereotypes that they have now have survived. You know, they go back to early contact period, when my ancestors, after contact, you know, they welcomed the Anglophones and the Francophones. They were the host society at the time. And then as a result of population growth within Wabanaki territory, we lost that control. And then not only that, the people who wrote about the Wabanakis back in the 1600s and 1700s, they described my ancestors as savage people, barbarous people, heathens, uncivilized people, and so on. So believe it or not, some of those stereotypes still exist today. And these were introduced back in the 1600s. So they have survived, and those stereotypes and misconceptions have definitely influenced policies of the governments. They've influenced the programs, and they've also influenced the actions taken by those within those institutions in how they interact with the Wabanaki people. And unfortunately, the interactions are always, as we discussed the other day, some of those interactions will lead to death, you know, because of stereotypes. The other day I shared some experiences in the health system, for example, where my cousin went to the emergency and on Friday evening, and of course the nurses working at the emergency, they thought that she was drinking. My cousin complained about headaches, and the nurses thought that she was drinking, so they told her, take a couple aspirins and go home. You'll be okay. And then next morning, she passed away of aneurysm. So they didn't take the time to do what they had to do to ensure that that they would find the problem in terms of what caused the headaches. But the assumption was made at that time that, she was drinking, now she has a headache, she has a hangover, now she wants us to give her some maybe Tylenol, maybe pills and so on, aspirin. So that's an example of how that stereotype of the drunken Indian influenced the action of those nurses and their treatment, or lack of treatment, I should say, in how they dealt with her at the time. Another example I shared the other day was when my wife, I was away at a conference, and my wife was here in Tobique, and she had this awful pain on her side. And she called me. She said that she's having a rough time, and I suggested to her maybe she should call her niece to take her to the emergency, and which she did, and she went to the emergency. And when she got there, the first thing they asked her, "Have you been drinking?" And of course my niece got upset with the nurses because my niece said, "Well, she doesn't drink. She's a sun dancer. She's a sweat lodge keeper. She's a sacred pipe carrier. And to occupy those roles, you have to be drug and alcohol free. So she has no alcohol in her system whatsoever, no drugs in her system." But the nurses, they weren't listening. They just told her, take Tylenol, go home. If it gets worse, then come back. And by the morning, it did get worse, and she had to go back and then complain about the pain once again. And fortunately, at the time, there was a doctor that came in to do his rounds, and he did more than what the nurses did night before and that morning. So he did examine her and had to take her to another hospital for surgery. She had appendicitis, so that could have been lethal as well if she didn't get the proper treatment. So that's an example of how practices, how actions, how stereotypes, how misconceptions may lead to, they could be deadly at times. For me, systemic racism is dangerous for the people who are victims of systemic racism, because the institution itself is reinforcing that. They have to do something within the institution to ensure that they, in the case of the Wabanakis, ensure that we dispel the stereotypes and the misconceptions that they hold within that institution.
You gave some great examples of kind of what that looks like within our healthcare system, and we've talked about some of these examples in previous episodes. When we talked about a woman from Saskatchewan, where, long story short, the partner locked the male partner locked himself in the home with their child, while the female partner was outside. She phoned the police. The police arrived and subsequently arrested her for allegedly being intoxicated while leaving the son in the home with the partner, who was in a rage, and ultimately the father ended up killing the child. Same thing is with Joyce Echequan in Quebec, where she was in the hospital in excruciating pain, and nurses, this was on live fed to Facebook at the time, telling her to stop complaining, just die, she's a waste of space. And so these continue to perpetuate the systemic problems that have ingrained themselves in these cultures within so many different aspects of our society. And it leads to topics that we've discussed here, is how we need to have a public inquiry into systemic racism. We were in a great dialogue with Dialogue NB of discussing the need for that, but also mentioning the need for it, that it's being Indigenous led. And we've talked about how there's so many different forms of racism, and how each form of racism is different within the community. So the Black experience and racism that Dr. Christie and I may face is very different than that of what an Indigenous community member would face, or that of a Syrian community member would face. But it is clear that, when we talk about these statistics and we talk about the need for it, but if you wouldn't mind taking a moment just to talk about the importance of having an Indigenous led public inquiry, and maybe offer some insight of what that could look like within the New Brunswick context.
Yes, sure. Maybe I'll put this in the context of what happened with Chantel Moore, as a way of elaborating on what we have to do to ensure that the inquiry, the independent inquiry that's needed in that particular situation, if the premier decides to instruct the justice system to initiate independent inquiry. We've always argued, the Wolastoqi chiefs have argued, as well as the Mi'kmaq chiefs, have always argued that if we're going to be investigating racist situations similar to what happened with Chantel Moore, then you should have Wabanaki people involved in that inquiry, that investigation. Look what happened after Chantel Moore, and the premier refused to instruct the justice system to initiate the inquiry, independent inquiry. So the premier went outside, went to Quebec, and brought in these people, so-called experts, former police, former RCMP. They came in and they conducted what they called an investigation. And I'm not convinced that this was objective, because they were all non-Indigenous former RCMP officers or police officers in Quebec. So I'm not convinced that they were being objective in how they dealt with this, because I, from experience, in reading about what's happening across the country with regards to independent inquiries or inquests and so on, I'm not convinced that they were objective in finding the facts, revealing the facts of what happened on that particular evening when Chantel Moore was shot. And so I was expecting, after they announced that this Quebec unit will be coming in, I was expecting that they would only cover up what happened. They're not going to address racism. And that's exactly what happened. Their report to the province of New Brunswick was that, no, we don't find this as a racist situation. We don't find this as systemic racism. And what the officer did when he shot Chantel Moore was in accordance with the training that he received leading up to his position as a police officer. So I would argue that maybe if they would have had an independent inquiry with the Wabanaki people involved, they could have invited people like Drayden Nicholas, for example, former lieutenant governor, a lawyer, a Wolastoqi lawyer. They could have also invited Pam Palmater, a Mi'kmaq lawyer, to be part of that inquiry, but they didn't do that.
I think you're spot on. And just to remind our viewers about Chantel Moore and the details, is what happened was one of Chantel's friends called the police and said, would you please do a wellness check on her? I'm concerned that maybe she's being detained or coerced, or someone's illegally obtained her phone or something. Could you check on her? So this police officer in Edmundston went up the fire escape of her building. He knocked on her window, and she was sleeping on the couch. So he could see she was sleeping peacefully on the couch and that there was nothing bad going on. But he proceeded to wake her up. And when she woke up, she grabbed a knife, went on the deck, and she was shot and killed. And the police officer, so when the inquiry happened by the Quebec group, what they asked is, should we charge this police officer with murder? And the inquiry said no, it's a homicide, but you as a police officer, you were justifiably in danger or fear of your life. Now, okay, I understand that. If we look at all police shootings in Canada, though, once again, police are much more gentle with white people in that situation than with Indigenous or Black people. So what you're saying, I think, could be partially they're asking the wrong question. Would an inquiry asking what impact did racism have here? Why was this police officer so insistent on waking this person up when he could see that she's safe? Why is he scared for his life when he sees an Indigenous person, when this situation happens all over the world and people don't end up dead? So I work in the hospital sector. We have patients in mental health crisis come into the hospital and they'll be armed, and we do not shoot and kill them. And this happens on a daily basis. So there are ways of dealing with people that are in a mental health crisis that doesn't require shooting and killing. why is it that that's the only option available to this police officer? And that leads to broader questions like defund the police, change their training, how, you know, there's a whole lot of improvements we could have. But I guess the point that we want to emphasize is an inquiry without Indigenous people might be asking the wrong questions. So then the government gets convenient answers that confirm what they want to hear, but they're the wrong questions. So, what, you know, from your perspective, would there be some specific questions you think that Indigenous people would be asking that white people just wouldn't think about? And that leads to the second thing I wanted to say before you answer my question is, we always have people asking, what is your definition of systemic discrimination? What is the definition of systemic racism? And I love how you put it. Those of us who experience it, we don't need the definition. So the people asking for that definition are the ones who have no idea what the hell it's about because they're not experiencing it. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit about what the value of having Indigenous people leading this inquiry would be. Okay.
Well, first of all, I think in terms of defining the concept systemic racism, you know, it's always difficult for those who have never experienced racism to understand it, even when we define it for them. You know, in my work in the education system, in particular, you know, I don't know how many times I've had to, or I was willing to define it as part of my presentation to the education people, the educators, that is. So, but you know, some may understand the harm that it causes, you know, in terms of the impacts it has on your self-concept, on your self-esteem, on your identity, and so on within the education system. Some may understand it, but others will never understand because they've never experienced it, and they will. And even if they reflect on the definition, then they may come to the conclusion that, well, you know, he or she is being too sensitive. You know, we're sensitive about name calling, for example. So we get too sensitive and we define it, and they should be just, you know, they shouldn't get bothered by being called a savage person or uncivilized. Excuse me, uncivilized and so on. So we need to do a lot of work in terms of convincing the New Brunswick citizens and accept and coming to an understanding of what systemic racism means to us and the harms and the impacts it has on our identity as well as our even our communities as well. So we need to do more of the education. We need to educate the public about what that means to us, and give and provide some examples as we did the other day. And not only that, then going back to the inquiry, I think you know, the questions I would ask if I was part of that inquiry, if this was a independent inquiry consisting of First Nations people, Wabanaki people, my question would be now here's a situation you have as you described it. Here's a situation you have an Indigenous woman with a knife. And then you're there and you have a baton, you have and of course a revolver. You know, I know it's only, you know, you only have maybe seconds to decide what you want to do, how to defend yourself. But why is it that the first thought was to shoot her? You know, why not have use the baton, for example, to disarm her? But the first thought was, this is a dangerous woman. This is an Indigenous woman, and I'm going to have to put her down. And I'm not saying that's what he was thinking, but I'd like to know what he was thinking at that particular time, and why is it that he decided to choose that option of using his revolver rather than his baton, and finding ways to, you know, why, you know, it just, I get, when I hear that story, I'm curious, why did he decide that the first option would be to put her down right away?
I think you're absolutely, that's a wonderful thought to end on, is why was it? And I think at the end of the day, he might have been reasoning according to stereotypes.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're going to thank you for being
Yeah.
on NBWA today. We always
Okay.
conclude with some concluding thoughts. So I'm going to ask Matthew first. Matthew, do you have any concluding thoughts that you want to end with today?
Well, Dr. Perley, thank you for being here with us today. I have to agree. I think it's clear that we do need a public inquiry into systemic racism, both for our Indigenous communities, not being a member of the Indigenous community, but looking in. In my opinion, it is absolutely clear the racism, the systemic racism that Indigenous community members face. To me, looking at these statistics, I cannot rationalize how or place stereotypes into for that being a factor. So I have to agree with you that there absolutely is a need for an Indigenous-led public inquiry. These type of racist acts aren't going to change if we're not taking action, and then we need to start taking proactive action. We can't just be being reactive to situations. We need to take that proactive steps.
And I think my concluding thought is directed to our government. You know that we had 2 Indigenous people shot and killed here in New Brunswick within the same month. That's a friggin' problem. You know how to fix the problem. You know how to address the problem. So I would say to the Premier, you know what? If the truth hurts, get over it. We're not here to be focusing on your sensitivities as a white man, but there is a problem facing our brothers and sisters in New Brunswick, and it should be addressed. And what is the harm of having an Indigenous-led inquiry into this? There is no downside. All it can do is help us get at least a step closer to the truth. So they should be ashamed of themselves for not doing it.
Yeah.
So that being said, we'll give you the last word.
Sure. Thank you. And I fully agree with your position and that racism, expression of racism in different forms should be people who express racism should be charged. I fully agree with that. When I look at what happened in Nova Scotia, I'm not saying it's perfect. All I'm saying is that they've taken the step to pass the Dismantling Racism and Hatred Act, and I looked at it. You know, it could be a little stronger. Hopefully, that New Brunswick will also pass something similar to it and make it stronger, and have those ones who are expressing racism in New Brunswick to be charged as you have mentioned earlier, because it's going to take time to eliminate racism in New Brunswick.
Well, Dr. Perley, we'd like to thank you for being here with us today. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to meet with us, but we'd also like to thank you for the work that you're doing within the Indigenous communities, but as well within New Brunswick as a whole. For our viewers, if you'd like to ask us questions or leave us comments or discuss certain topics, or us reach out to individuals to have on the show, please feel free to email us at nbwa@chco.tv. My name's Matthew Martin, and Black Lives Matter.